This is Craig Brown, and welcome to Passages. Passages is a space to explore Bible passages used for preaching, reflection, and prayer. My hope is that Passages will shine a unique light on text used for preaching at the First Free Methodist Church of Seattle, or for anyone looking to dive deeper into the Bible. Today's passage is Matthew chapter 15, verses 21 to 28. It's the basis for the sermon at the First Free Methodist Church on June 22nd, 2025. It's part of our series called Gathered to Go, How to Serve Jesus Today. So let's hear the text from Matthew 15, beginning at verse 21 in the New American Standard Bible in its 2020 revision. Jesus went away from there and withdrew into the region of Tyre and Sidon. And a Canaanite woman from that region came out and began to cry out, saying, "Have mercy on me, Lord, Son of David. My daughter is severely demon-possessed." But he did not answer her with even a word. And his disciples came up and urged him, saying, "Send her away, because she keeps shouting at us." But he answered and said, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." But she came and began to bow down before him, saying, "Lord, help me." Yet he answered and said, "It is not good to take the children's bread and to throw it to the dogs." And she said, "Yes, Lord, but please help, for even the dogs feed on the crumbs that fall from their master's table." Then Jesus said to her, "O woman, your faith is great. It shall be done for you as you desire." And her daughter was healed at once. This is such a fascinating text from Matthew chapter 15. We're going to look at it in three different sections, beginning with verses 21 and 22 to talk about this unusual request. We have here one of the more difficult stories in the life of Jesus. Now, the Gospel of Mark has this same story that is also in Matthew. Now, Jesus has left whatever region he had been in, and he has now come to the region of Tyre and Sidon, two cities along the Mediterranean coast. Now, many people and scholars have struggled over the years with the image of Jesus in this story. If we step into some context, though, the story will have a richness that we might have otherwise missed. Now, in verse 21, it says that Jesus went away from there. Well, there's no way to be certain of what the antecedent to the pronoun there is. We don't know, in a sense, where there is. We speculate it's the places that Jesus was just at, perhaps in Matthew's Gospels, where he was in a conversation with the Pharisees near the Sea of Galilee with the story of Peter walking on the water. But to be honest, it helps to think of it less in terms of geography. Perhaps kind of think of it as an environment of unbelief. The preceding stories outline the failure of belief, whether it's the Pharisees failing to embrace his message, whether it's Peter practically drowning in the Sea of Galilee because he fails to walk on water. I mean, there's a lot of stories right before this about how there's a failure of faith in the Jewish context. But if we go all the way back to the 8th chapter of Matthew's Gospel, we read the story of the Roman centurion's daughter who was raised from the dead. And so this story, along with the centurion's daughter, have a lot of parallels. So a lot of these stories of unbelief happen in Jewish context with Jewish leaders, Jesus' own disciples. But our story here and that of the centurion's daughter earlier have some really interesting parallels, especially in how they end. But the text tells us that Jesus withdrew into this region of Tyre and Sidon. Now, these are Syro-Phoenician cities. The Syro is a shortened form of Syria, and Phoenician, of course, is the full spelling of Phoenicians. These are those people groups that settled and lived along the Mediterranean coast, all the way practically from the border of Egypt all the way up to what is today Lebanon. Now, as we learn about Tyre and Sidon, we have to remember that this is the region north of Galilee where Jesus has been. And in this particular region, there were many Jews who lived there. So what we need to be careful of here is understanding that it says that he withdrew into the region of Tyre and Sidon. That doesn't mean he went to those two cities. It simply means he withdrew into the region. So if he was in the Galilee and were to travel kind of straight to the north or even northwest, he would find himself in this region. And it's here, in this place, that a Canaanite woman comes out to meet him. So regardless of the location, wherever Jesus is, the woman is a Gentile. Now, a Canaanite is an interesting title that's used for her, and it may refer, of course, to the inhabitants of the land when Israel conquered it. So when Israel left Egypt and traveled for 40 years in the wilderness and Moses died, Joshua takes over, and then Joshua brings the Israelites into the land, there were Canaanites living there. And so it's interesting that Matthew uses a title for this woman that dates back centuries upon centuries upon centuries. Doubtless, it's something that Matthew's readers, who were all Jewish Christians scattered in the Gentile world, would have immediately understood. Mark, on the other hand, who writes the story, he uses a title for this woman as the Syro-Phoenician woman. That's something that might be more understood locally. So Matthew taps into this old word, Canaanite, and it really is a kind of a pointed term in this regard because no one's really called themselves a Canaanite in centuries, but Matthew points at this woman with that title. And when she cries out to him, she says several things there in verse 22. She says, first, have mercy on me. So first of all, this Gentile woman comes to Jesus in a posture of humility and submission. The second thing she does is she calls him Lord. She correctly addresses Jesus. And this is in contrast to observant Jews who did not address Jesus with that title. And then she calls him Son of David. Such a fascinating reference for a Canaanite woman to pull that out of her hat. The Son of David. This is the messianic title for Jesus. And then she explains that her daughter is severely possessed by a demon. Nothing else is known. We don't know if this woman has a husband, what family she comes from. How did she know who Jesus was? The text doesn't tell us any of that information. It only tells us that Matthew describes her as a Canaanite woman. She approaches Jesus with this great exclamation of praise and thanks to him and her request. And it opens up a key passageway to us, that God is working before we get there, wherever there is. God is working before we get there. You know, for Free Methodists and for Wesleyans, this is an important truth in our theology. We believe deeply in what's called prevenient grace, the grace of God that's at work in a person's life before they have an awareness of it, and even before the people around them have an awareness of it. Prevenient grace has been at work in this woman's life so that she comes seeking Jesus, already holding a degree of faith. You see, before Jesus' arrival, God has already been at work in her life, and it's been unperceived until the right time. So we do well to remember that God is at work in every life and every heart, all before we get there. We have to hold the truth that it is God who does the converting work, not us. Now, we turn to the middle section of this story in verses 23 to 27. And this is really about how persistence really does matter. The central part of this story is perhaps the most troubling. There's an apparent contrast between people here, Jews on the one hand, Gentiles on the other. Verse 23 begins with Jesus not answering her at all. So she comes, she calls him Lord, Son of David, she makes her request. He ignores her. Now, there are several ways we could take this. So first, that this is some kind of test for the woman. It's very rabbinic in nature. It's not unusual for rabbis to practice this technique of kind of putting off a person who makes a request that they don't know to see how persistent or how faithful they are. Sounds kind of manipulative. The second option is that, as some scholars have suggested, that this story is a fable. that it actually never happened, and it's designed to teach us a truth about Gentile faith. So the problem here is that Jesus in the story, you see, he's not really in character. We're just not used to seeing Jesus who ignores people or pushes them away. The third option, of course, is that Jesus is just as xenophobic and a misogynist as all of his Jewish contemporaries. Gentile woman, he has no time for her. It's inappropriate for him to speak with her in public, so he's completely dismissive. Now, I just gave you three choices, and none of those are good choices alone, in my opinion. But perhaps there's just a tiny, tiny bit of truth in all three. So let's just keep going and see what happens. Now, when the woman comes and makes her request, the disciples respond to the woman by asking Jesus to send her away. And it's a really strange and ambiguous phrasing here. The grammar is not clear. It might mean to send her away with nothing, or it might mean that the disciples are telling Jesus to do whatever she wants to make her go away, in which case Jesus gives her everything. Now, the disciples, they just might simply assume that Jesus will grant whatever it is the woman wants, because this is typically what they see Jesus doing most of the time. But at the heart of it is this, is that the disciples are not really interested in the coming of the kingdom here. They just want this woman to stop and to go away. So their interest is truly self-serving, at least the way Matthew records it. Now, verse 24 is quite interesting because the grammar here, again, doesn't indicate to whom Jesus says this phrase. When he says, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Did Jesus say this to his disciples who had just asked him to make the woman go away? Does he say this to the woman? The text isn't clear. All we know is that Jesus responds by giving an articulation of his mission, that he's sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So when the woman hears this, or at least whether she heard it or not, she turns the ratchet with her persistence. She dials it up, and so she came and she bowed down before him. Now this is new in Matthew's gospel. No one in Israel has done this so far. She is worshiping him. It's the posture of worship to bow down before him. And she cries out, Lord, help me. You see, this is the posture of grace. This is the posture of desperation, of longing, of a kind of hunger that has gripped her. Now, we know many parables of Jesus that speak about this same kind of persistence and how much it is valued. But she refuses to quit. So she's very much like some of those parables Jesus told about persistence, about people who come again and again in the middle of the night coming to make their request, and how valuable that is as a discipline of prayer. She's very much the same way. So now Jesus directly speaks to her after she cries out, Lord, help me. And he says, it is not good to take the children's bread and give it to the dogs. Well, of the three options I shared earlier, number 3 seems to look likely, that he's just disgusted with her, as most within the Jewish community would probably be. But before we go that far, let's just talk about dogs. Now, there are 2 different words for dog. One is dog as in a mangy stray, a wild dog. And there's another word for dog that refers to the dog that's domesticated, a dog that is the pet. And that's the word Jesus uses here. So it may just be a nuance. I mean, he's kind of indirectly calling her a dog, but notice the nuance here. Not some kind of wild dog that shouldn't be known or acquainted with. No, it's a dog that's a pet in a house. And then second, Jesus tells her something that she already knows. He says that part of the mission that he has is to the Jews first. Paul, who will come, of course, after Jesus, talks about this quite a bit, and that how often in his ministry he would go to the Jewish communities first in their synagogues and preach and teach, and only after doing that would he then go speak and work with the Gentiles. You see, the faith of the Jews was theirs, and one could only share in it by converting. If this woman knows who Jesus is and what he can do. And what he's telling her is something that she actually already knows. So when he says this kind of caustic statement to her, it's not good to take the children's bread and give it to the dogs. This is not a piece of information she didn't know. Jesus keeps his mission fixed with a laser focus. Gentiles will find their part after his death and resurrection. But in this case, as Jesus describes it, when he says it is not good to take the children's bread and give it to the dogs, we can just interpret the statement that he's just offered, that the children are Israel, the bread is the word or the work of God, and the dogs are the Gentiles. But then comes her response, and for me, this is the pivot. She says, "Yes, Lord." In some ways, it confirms that she knows exactly what Jesus is telling her. She knows it and accepts it. She knows she's an outsider, hence her intense persistence. She tells Jesus that even the dogs, and she uses the same word for dog here, dog as in pet, eat the crumbs from the master's table. Now, this proverb of the dogs eating the crumbs from the master's table had to do with referring to the mess that children make at the table, that usually there's food flying all over the place. And having raised 2 children, I can attest to the fact that food goes all over the place when children are small. So the dogs would eat that. We had 2 Labradors that would come and make sure they ate anything that got onto the floor. And so this was very common understanding of what dogs did in a house. Dog owners all know it. So then all of a sudden this story is sounding like option number 2 of the options I shared above it. This is just kind of a fabled story. I mean, we can't imagine Jesus acting this way. It's so out of character for him. But before we try to draw too many conclusions, let's just wonder for a second if maybe it's a little bit of all 3. And that has to do with the key passageway that I want to share. That Jesus is always seeking a deeper faith in him. Jesus is always seeking a deeper faith in him. Now remember, I gave 3 options earlier. One of which Jesus is responding like a rabbi, simply making this woman jump through some hoops and to prove that she has genuine faith. Or number 2, the story is a fable, really designed to help us understand how Jesus's ministry extends to the Gentiles. Or number 3, that Jesus is just like everybody else in the Jewish world, someone who really had disdain for Gentile people and for women in particular. Let me try reframing those 3 statements just slightly in a different manner. So let's try number 1. That Jesus must make certain this woman has faith in him and not what he can do. Number 2, Matthew offers this story in a context where his Jewish readers, remember, Matthew's written to a Jewish community of people who are in the Gentile world, can appreciate it. Now, parts of the story are amplified. The way Matthew writes this story is a little different than how Mark writes the story. Matthew writes this story so that his hearers can understand it in the Roman and Greek world in which they live. And that these Jews who are scattered abroad in the Roman world that Matthew writes to could begin to see their work as missionaries to the Gentiles who are also waiting for the hope of salvation. And then there's number 3. That Jesus is a man of his time. The fact that he even goes to the region of Tyre and Sidon is a risk. He's not focused on his mission to Israel, but there's a certain sense when you read this story in Matthew's gospel, going back maybe to Matthew chapter 14 and reading forward, you find that there's some sense that Jesus is probably a bit fatigued by their lack of belief. This is conjecture and speculation, but there's a sense in which he just goes through one barrier after another with people who should be of faith but are not. And so the irony of the story is that Jesus finds faith where it's not expected at all. Jesus seeks the same kind of faith in us as Gentiles too. We have to remember that we must have a sense of gratefulness that we've been included in God's plan for salvation. We, as Gentiles, must be reminded that our faith is a Jewish one. Paul says that the only reason we're included in God's plan of salvation is because of grace. So what I might suggest is something we don't think about very often. We must never take our inclusion in God's mission for granted. And if you want to read a little bit more about this, I'd encourage you to turn to one of Paul's writings in Romans chapter 9 through Romans chapter 11 for a bit of a primer on this truth. And Paul makes the argument that those who are now Gentiles who are coming to faith, the faith that justified Abraham is the faith that justifies us, that Gentiles who come to this faith should not enter into it in an entitled way or looking down upon their Jewish siblings, that we should never take for granted what God has done. And now we come to verse 28, the closing verse of this strange and peculiar passage of Scripture. It's an unusual blessing that happens here. Jesus then offers a blessing we've only seen once before in the Gospel of Matthew. Jesus says that her faith is great in the same way he spoke of the centurion's faith way back in Matthew chapter 8. It's fascinating that even up to Matthew chapter 15, that Jesus heaps the most amount of praise on two Gentiles over everyone else. So what we learn here is that the blessing of Jesus has actually nothing to do with being Jewish or even being Gentile. It's really a little bit more about location. The centurion was in the heart of Galilee, and he found faith there. This woman is in the next region over, in a dominantly Gentile part of the world. Does Jesus expect to find faith in the region of Tyre and Sidon? He says, "O woman, your faith is great." He offers this praise to a Canaanite woman, but not any Jewish religious leaders. The point of the story is about surprising faith in the least expected places. And then as the story ends, it's so interesting that the healing happens to her daughter. Her daughter is delivered almost as an afterthought. There's no details. It doesn't tell us about how it happened or in the aftermath. It's just that it was done. And that opens a final key passageway for us we can't forget. And it's this, that faith in Jesus is enough. Faith in Jesus is enough. The least common denominator for people is not just their humanity. We might look around and see ourselves as all human beings. We may look different, talk different, act different. But there's really another least common denominator between us, and it's our faith. Everyone, even today, has faith. It's not about whether we have faith or not. It's about where our faith is directed. Is our faith directed at the idols of our day? Is our faith directed at what Jesus can do for us? Or is our faith directed at Jesus himself? This story of a Canaanite woman is framed by grace and faith. Honestly, she has everything going against her. And faith in Jesus is what sets the story aright. We might learn something from her persistence, her devotion, and her faith. Passages, this podcast is migrating to a new feed. I'd encourage you to please subscribe to the FFMC podcast feed, just 4 simple letters, FFMC, using your favorite podcasting app. Passages will be published each week along with sermons and other great content. I'd also encourage you to visit ffmc.org to learn more about Free Methodism and how you can connect with our community. For now, I bid you all grace. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.